All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to do a really interesting deep dive. And it's going to be on, let's see if I can get the full title out.
Hi.
Role of solar photovoltaics for a sustainable energy system in Puerto Rico in the context of the entire Caribbean, featuring the value of offshore floating systems.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Yeah,
It is a mouthful. We're going to be referring to it throughout the show as this study, but it's important to give the full title at the beginning at least once.
yeah, makes sense.
So basically, we're diving deep into understanding how Puerto Rico and the Caribbean more broadly can really make this shift towards a completely renewable energy system.
Right, and the sources you shared with me, like this study we're talking about, they really paint a picture of what that could look like, by 2050.
Yeah, and what's cool is that it even considers some pretty unique challenges, like, you know, islands don't have endless space.
Exactly. Land availability is a big one. And this study, it gets into some potential solutions like offshore floating solar panels, which is really innovative.
Yeah, we're going to try to break all that down for you today. Like, what are the big takeaways from this study so you can understand the possibilities and what's really at stake without getting bogged down in, like, the super technical stuff.
Right. And I think it's important to keep in mind why this matters. We're talking about climate change, sustainable development, and energy security for these island nations, which are particularly vulnerable.
Totally. So let's start with kind of setting the scene. Where do things stand right now with renewable energy in the Caribbean and Puerto Rico?
Well, based on this study,
Hmm.
it seems like they're a bit behind, when it comes to adopting renewable energy. They're calling it lagging.
Lagging. Okay. And why is that? What are some of the factors contributing to that?
Well, one thing this study points to is the cost of electricity. Like back in 2020, the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, was over 100 euros per megawatt hour in the region.
Euros per megawatt hour. Okay. And so how does that compare to like other parts of the world?
That's really high, much higher than a lot of other places. So that's a significant factor, making it tough to transition.
Yeah, I mean, those high energy costs, they must have real consequences for people living there.
Oh, absolutely. This study talks about how energy crises disproportionately affect islands. Like, think about it, higher costs, energy poverty, and ultimately it hurts economic prosperity.
Right, it's kind of a ripple effect.
Exactly. And what's interesting is this study points out that there hasn't been a ton of research on comprehensive energy transition pathways for the whole Caribbean. Like, a lot of studies have focused on individual islands or specific technologies.
Right, so this one's taking a much broader approach.
Yeah, looking at the whole picture.
So, okay, let's get to the heart of it. What's the vision that this study lays out? What are they aiming for?
So the main goal here is pretty ambitious. They're talking about 100% renewable energy across all sectors, meaning power, heat, and transport for both Puerto Rico and the entire Caribbean
Wow, by when?
by 2050. That's the target.
2050. Okay, that's not that far off.
No, it's not. And, it seems achievable based on what they're proposing.
So they're saying 100% renewable energy by 2050. Now, we talked about the high cost of electricity. Does this study suggest that, like, switching to renewables could actually bring those costs down?
It does, significantly, in fact. For Puerto Rico, they're projecting the LCOE could drop to 47.4 euros per megawatt hour by 2050.
Okay, so almost half.
Yeah, and for the Caribbean as a whole, even lower, 31.9 euros per megawatt hour.
Wow, so that's a massive decrease.
Yeah.
And this study emphasizes that it's not just about cheaper electricity, it's about the total cost of energy, right? Like
Right.
across all sectors.
Exactly. They're projecting those costs will fall too. For Puerto Rico, it could go from 79 euros per megawatt hour down to 53, and for the Caribbean, from over 100 to 43.
Okay, so we're talking about a real, like, economic game changer here.
Definitely. If they can pull this off, it could have a huge impact.
So how do they see this happening? Like, what's the key to reaching this 100% renewable goal, according to this study?
Well, one technology stands out in this study, solar PV, solar photovoltaics. They're saying it's going to play a dominating role in this energy transition.
Dominating. Okay. So, like, how much solar power are we talking about here?
By 2050, they're projecting solar PV will provide a whopping 81% of Puerto Rico's electricity.
81%. Wow.
And for the Caribbean, even more, 92%.
92%. So basically, almost all of their electricity would be coming from solar.
Pretty much. That's what this study suggests.
So that's got to be a lot of solar panels. Right?
Yeah, you're telling me. They're talking about massive installations. For Puerto Rico, it's projected to be 33.4 gigawatts of solar capacity.
Gigawatts, okay? And for the whole Caribbean.
Hold on to your hat, 332 gigawatts.
332, that's huge.
Yeah, it's comparable to some pretty big countries in terms of electricity generation.
So that brings up a question, right? We've got these islands, not exactly known for their vast open spaces. How do they plan to fit all these solar panels, according to this study?
That's a really important point. And that's where this idea of offshore floating PV comes in. This study suggests that a good chunk of those solar panels could actually be placed out on the ocean.
On the ocean. Interesting. So like floating platforms with solar panels on them?
Exactly. It's a way to overcome the limitations of land availability, which, as we discussed, is a big issue for islands.
Makes sense. So did this study actually look into what that would look like for Puerto Rico?
They did. They ran some scenarios. In one scenario, they assumed only 1% of Puerto Rico's land could be used for ground-mounted solar. And in that case, they projected a need for 17.5 gigawatts of offshore floating PV to meet the island's energy demand.
17.5 gigawatts. That's a lot of floating solar.
It is, but they also looked at a scenario with more land available, like 6% for ground-mounted PV. And in that case, they found that no offshore floating PV would be needed.
Interesting.
And the total system cost was even a bit lower in that scenario, like about 2.7% lower.
So it seems like having more land available for solar could potentially save some money.
That's what this study indicates.
Okay, what about the Caribbean as a whole? Does offshore floating PV play a big role there too, according to this study?
Oh yeah, definitely. The study suggests that up to 38% of all utility-scale PV in the Caribbean could be offshore floating.
38%, so a significant chunk. Are there specific areas that are particularly well suited for that?
This study highlighted a few. Haiti, for example, and the Venezuelan islands, they could see some of the highest proportions of offshore floating PV, potentially over 50% of their electricity generation.
Wow, so it seems like this technology could be a real game changer for certain parts of the Caribbean.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It offers a solution for those places where land is particularly scarce.
Now, we've been talking a lot about solar, but solar power is, well, it's intermittent, right? The sun isn't always shining. Does this study look at other technologies, to fill in the gaps?
It does. They mention onshore wind power, for instance. They say it's actually quite competitive in the near term, like in the 2030s, especially in places like Puerto Rico.
Okay, so wind could be a good option in the short term.
Yeah, but they also suggest that as the costs of offshore floating PV continue to decline, wind might become less dominant later on.
Okay, so maybe it's more of a bridge technology.
That's what this study seems to indicate.
And then, of course, there's the question of energy storage, right? Like, how do you deal with the variability of solar power, making sure there's enough electricity when you need it?
Oh, that's crucial. And this study emphasizes the importance of electricity storage, particularly batteries. They say it's vital for managing that variability and ensuring a reliable electricity supply. And they even talk about electric vehicles potentially playing a role through vehicle-to-grid technology, which is pretty cool.
Vehicle to grid, so like using the batteries in electric cars to help balance the grid.
Exactly. It's a way to tap into a potentially huge source of storage capacity.
That's fascinating. So this study sees batteries as a big part of the solution.
Oh yeah, big time. They're projecting a substantial increase in electricity storage. Like by 2050, they estimate about 27% of all generated electricity will be stored in batteries at some point.
27%, that's a lot of batteries.
It is. And that includes batteries at the utility level, in homes, businesses, and as we said, in electric vehicles.
Now, this study also mentions something called electrolyzers and hydrogen storage. What's that all about?
That gets into what they call sector coupling, which basically means connecting different parts of the energy system. So electrolyzers use electricity to produce hydrogen, and then that hydrogen can be stored and used as a fuel, or it can be converted back into electricity when needed.
So it's another form of energy storage.
Exactly. And it's particularly useful for linking the electricity sector with things like transportation and industry.
I see. So with all these different renewable sources and storage options, is there concern about wasting energy, like generating more than you can actually use?
That's called curtailment, and it can be a problem with renewables. But this study actually projects relatively low levels of curtailment, like around 3.4 to 3.5% by 2050.
So not too bad.
No. And that suggests that the mix of renewables, the storage, and the sector coupling they're proposing should be pretty effective at utilizing the electricity that's generated.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about transportation. How does this study envision the transportation sector changing as part of this transition to 100% renewables?
Well, they see a big move towards electrification, battery electric vehicles for cars and trucks. And they also talk about using e-hydrogen for certain applications, probably heavier vehicles or things like that.
Okay, what about planes and ships? Those are tougher to electrify, right?
Right. For those, this study assumes we'll likely need to import fuels like EFTL and ELNG, which are essentially synthetic fuels produced using renewable energy.
So still relying on imports, but at least those fuels would be produced sustainably.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shifting the emissions elsewhere, but hopefully to places with more renewable energy capacity.
Okay, so how much of the electricity would be needed for transportation in this scenario, specifically for Puerto Rico?
The study estimates about 19% of Puerto Rico's total electricity generation by 2050 would go towards transportation, either for charging electric vehicles or for producing e-hydrogen.
19%? That's a sizable chunk.
It is. Shows how important electrifying transportation is for this whole transition.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of the technical aspects. What are some of the broader economic and societal implications that this study highlights?
Well, as we discussed, they project significant reductions in energy costs, which is obviously a good thing for the economy as a whole.
Right, cheaper energy means more money for people to spend on other things.
Exactly. And while we'll see a decrease in spending on fossil fuels, there will be an increase in investments in renewable energy infrastructure, things like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries.
So a shift in spending rather than a decrease.
Yeah, and that shift in spending could potentially create new jobs, in the renewable energy sector.
Right, jobs in manufacturing, installation, maintenance.
Exactly. And this study also touches on the importance of government policies. Like they point to other research showing a strong link between supportive policies, things like net metering, and the successful growth of renewable energy.
Net metering, that's where people with solar panels can sell their excess electricity back to the grid, right?
Right. So having the right policies in place will be key to making this transition happen.
Makes sense. Now, of course, no study is perfect, right?
Hmm.
What are some of the limitations that this study acknowledges?
Yeah, there are a few. For example, they didn't go into great detail on all the different types of ocean energy technologies like wave energy or ocean thermal energy conversion.
Right.
And they didn't do in-depth modeling of offshore wind potential or desalination, which is important for some islands.
Okay, so those are areas for future research. What else do they suggest looking into?
They mentioned the impact of interannual variability of solar resources, which means how much sunlight varies from year to year.
So, like, making sure you have enough backup for those less sunny years.
Right. And they also suggest exploring the benefits of interconnecting the grids of different islands.
So, like, sharing energy between islands to improve reliability and potentially lower costs.
Exactly. And they briefly touch on the potential of using vertical bifacial PV systems, which are solar panels that can collect sunlight from both sides.
So, more efficient use of space. Interesting. So, to wrap things up, what's the big takeaway message from role of solar photovoltaics for a sustainable energy system in Puerto Rico in the context of the entire Caribbean featuring the value of offshore floating systems?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that achieving a 100% renewable energy system in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean by 2050 is not just a pipe dream, it's a feasible goal. And it comes with some major benefits.
Right. And solar photovoltaics are going to be the driving force behind that transition.
Absolutely. And it's
Yeah.
not just about the technology, it's about smart policies, investments, and collaboration to make it happen.
Well said. And this study really highlights how a region like the Caribbean, which is so vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, could actually become a leader in renewable energy.
I agree. It's an exciting vision, and with the right commitment, it could become a reality.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. Role of solar photovoltaics for a sustainable energy system in Puerto Rico in the context of the entire Caribbean featuring the value of offshore floating systems really lays out a path forward. So thinking about this, what steps can we take now to turn this vision into reality? That's something to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us.